of AviaDev Insight Africa, the podcast offering a window to the world of African aviation with your host, John Howell, CEO and founder of AviaDev. Today's podcast is a slight deviation away from the commercial African aviation landscape, although I am delighted to say that our guest is something of an av geek. Daniel Silke was guest number 3 on the podcast. We're now at episode 153. He hails from South Africa. He's a leading economic analyst and a fantastic presenter who's been involved in many of our conferences across the Middle East and Africa. And for those of you in South Africa, you're probably used to reading his articles or seeing him on the national news and maybe elsewhere around the world as well. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to sort of zoom out a little bit. We're going to take a deep dive into the global economic environment at a macro level. We're then going to understand what that means for Africa. And then we're going to sort of have a little bit of a chat about some specific markets within Africa as well, and what needs to happen from an economic perspective to even get us talking about recovery. So welcome to the podcast, Daniel.
John, thank you very much. If I was the third on your podcast, at least you survived beyond me, so I'm delighted to be here.
So for those of our guests, you're very welcome. For those of our guests who didn't hear the third episode, and you can go back and listen to that and prove us just how wrong we all were about what we were saying back then. Give us a little bit more information on, you and your background, because I know you've got really varied history, but also, how have you found as somebody who's a commentator and presenter, how have you found this transition to the virtual world?
Thanks, John. Well, as you know, I'm a political economy analyst. I talk about global themes, trends, Africa, and also obviously my home country of South Africa. I like to blend politics and economics together. Usually you have somebody doing one or the other. I do both. So it's a good package with somebody like me. It's been I think a difficult period for those of us who rely upon the events industry for work. We've seen, obviously, the move to virtual, and that move to virtual has its own pluses and minuses. It certainly allowed me to reach much larger global audiences than ever before. There aren't any logistical costs in bringing me into a particular event. And on that basis, there's a big plus for somebody who offers services like myself. But I do think at the same time that we've been chatting about it. There are just so many online events, so many webinars, so many interesting products that are available online that it really has crowded the space as well. And I think to some degree there's a little bit of Zoom or webinar fatigue that's crept into all of our lives. Even I know for myself, you might register for an event, but do you eventually pitch up for that event? And we see it certainly on audience attendances where we are here in South Africa. But it's a stimulating medium, the virtual. But nothing, I must tell you, replaces the physical. It's not just me being there physically, it's what the event really means. The event is a public relations exercise, a networking exercise, an opportunity for business to reward its members and those associated with it. And you can't get that out of a virtual session, no matter how good the virtual speakers are.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that everybody's getting used to this, and as we said, there are elements that are going to stay and there are elements that are going to go back and revert back to type. But ultimately, we're human beings. We need interaction, and that's how you build trust and relationships, through actually having shared experience and physically meeting people. And it's going to be very difficult if we have to sort of exist. So we'll come back to that conversation a bit later on. But while we've got you here, somebody with such deep knowledge, I wanted to start by sort of give us an overview of the sort of key macroeconomic trends to watch out for in 2021. What's happened, what is happening that we need to be aware of in 2021?
Well, look, I think fairly obviously the key issue here is what is the type of recovery that we are going to have. We spoke last year about a V-shaped recovery, which then morphed into a sort of a swoosh-shaped recovery, not quite as rapid as the V-shape. And I do think that we're in a kind of a swoosh-shaped recovery. We have seen certainly a dramatic uptick from the worst days of June, July, August last year. The recovery has been certainly in equity markets, which is positive all round. But for job markets across the world, for GDP growth across the world, there continues to be very mixed fortunes. And I do think that that's going to continue in a kind of a rocky road probably throughout this year until we eventually get the effectiveness of the vaccine program rolling out for some of the world's major economies. So GDP growth is definitely going to look that bit better this year now in 2021, coming off, of course, a disturbingly low base in 2020. So I think one shouldn't get too distracted by, what could be 4% GDP growth in the United States, because you're coming off a very low base, and that base effect has to be taken into account as well. But what I do look from a theme point of view is certainly not only the survival of China, but the rise and further rise of China as a growth market into the future. They've managed to handle the COVID epidemic, of course, remarkably well. And we've seen that China's GDP figures are likely to outstrip just about most other major economies, and quite substantially so. And that will have an impact upon Asia. Other Asian economies are going to do well, Vietnam in particular. And I do think that I've been speaking about the sort of rise of the Asian century, really. It's going to be the Asian decade, I think. And COVID, in a sense, has exacerbated and amplified many of those existing trends that were there before. Just a further theme, John, what I can look at, and I always like to look at, the positives and the negatives. I do think we must all be a lot more aware of issues relating to debt. Countries are incurring debt, not only in the developing world, but certainly in the developed world as well. We have to pay for COVID, and that means printing money. And even in the United States, that legacy of increasing debt is going to be borne ultimately. It'll be borne in two parts. One, hopefully by a growing economy, but it can also be borne by raising taxes. And we must be, I think, aware that there is a danger across the world, both developing and developed, that taxes, direct or indirect taxes, are going to perhaps be shuffled upwards, certainly over the course of the next 24 months or so.
Yeah, fantastic. It's really interesting you say that about the Asian markets, because, of course, there's been a traditionally, over the last 20, 30 years, there's a lot of investment, a lot of partnership between Africa and Asia itself. But sort of if we zoom in a bit more and we look at the African side of things, we obviously had the launch of the free trade area. And what we want as AviaDev, and what we want for the African aviation market, is for it to be better connected with itself first and foremost, before it necessarily works on the international markets and really spreading its wings that way. So how do you see the African Continental Free Trade Area having an impact? And can it work without liberalization of air transport and without the free movement of people?
Well, of course, it's interesting that the free movement of people via air really should, in my opinion, be augmented onto the African Free Trade Agreement. The two really should dovetail. And if African governments are really serious about lowering tariffs, cross-border red tape, then I think the same sincerity should be applied to aircraft travel across the African continent. I don't believe you can necessarily have one successfully without the other. So I would hope then that the Continental Free Trade Agreement perhaps renews the issues of liberalizing Africa's skies over the course of this year and next year. But I think the issue, is nice in theory, and we can talk about it. We know, after all, and I've been talking for years, that Africa needs to trade more with itself. We know that Africa barely does trade with itself when compared to the European Union, when compared to the Asian countries, or even when compared to Latin America. So African countries need to support each other and need to make it easy and cost-effective, logistically possible to do that. But it's nice saying it. The reality, of course, is that nationalism, protectionism, regional conflicts, cross-border issues, all are amplified across the African continent. And I think there's a long way to go before we really see this level of trade liberalization. It's good to have it in theory. It's good to have a document signed by all of the major countries across the continent. The issue will be, what is the political will across the African continent really to implement many of these changes, particularly the political will amongst the larger African countries who, perhaps have got a vested interest in keeping the systems as they are at the moment. So I think we're in sort of just an early phase of this. It's a phase, I think, that will continue perhaps for the next year, 2 or 3, and will also be impacted upon how the Nigerias and South Africas and Kenyas, as the big regional anchors, really move on liberalization. Just a last point on this, John, I don't mean to be sort of funny, but in terms of freeing up African air travel, we still have African countries wanting to run national airlines. We still have African countries pouring a lot of money into those airlines, and there is perhaps good justification for it. But if the justification is to protect routes and to protect certain state-owned enterprises, then I think we're going to run into a degree of inertia on the whole story. So we need a cross-disciplined liberalization. And I think they all need to work hand in hand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing that we've said is, if we're not using this opportunity now, where there's this hiatus in air transport and everybody has that opportunity to actually say, okay, there's an opportunity now to put in the building blocks. So when we come back, we're going to have all of those things in place, ready for that restart so that we can support that market. If we don't do it now, what worries me is we'll never do it, because this opportunity is actually that, don't waste a good crisis, as Churchill said. Never miss that opportunity. I really agree. I really think that's super important. I mean, we did some research before the pandemic, and why we're excited about what Africa has as an opportunity is only 35% of the largest cities in Africa were connected to each other by air. And when you look at the continent and how big it is and how landlocked it is the only way to do it. So when you compare that 35% with the US, with Asia, with Europe, it's half, if not less than half of the connectivity. So our belief was, you've got to start locally, regional, domestic, and then you can think about the international, and sort of take it forward from there. So I definitely see that. I think that the Continental Free Trade Area will work to an extent, but it will never have the impact without the other elements of this being implemented. And that there is just a lot of politics, and it gets very messy because each country has its own opinion, whether it has a national airline or not, and a vested interest.
I think, John, and if I might say, I think one of the other factors is that I believe air traffic will become even more important as a result of the fiscal constraints following from COVID. You are going to see budget deficits across many of the major African states, an inability to fund many of the infrastructure projects that might have been on the front burner 3, 4, 5 years ago. It could very well slow land-based infrastructural development, roads, railways, etc. So the air corridors become even more important from city to city. And COVID hasn't changed the fundamentals that I've been speaking about for years. Urbanization, growing populations, young people, a search for returns on investment, which Africa, of course, still does provide and can provide very handsomely into the future. So, the pluses of Africa, they haven't disappeared, but the physical mechanisms to attain those pluses are going to be more reliant upon air travel than ever before now as a result of COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. It becomes, I've always said that, you'll miss it when it's gone, guys. When you can't get that flight, or you realize that connection is 3 days later or whatever it may be, you're going to struggle, to get around, and that's just not good for Africa. So, taking all that into account, without the short, medium term fortunes for Africa, how would you kind of evaluate it, and what is it that's going to be needed? Is it the same as everywhere else? They're just going to have to print money, absorb debt, get it from wherever they can, and try and sort of survive it, ride it out?
Well, look, first and foremost, Africa needs an equitable share of global vaccines. So it would be remiss of me, if I'm talking about Africa, not to add my own voice to the global the global clamoring to distribute vaccines across the continent. I think that if we don't do that, we will really find that the shape of recovery in the world will be, as some have indicated, a K-shaped recovery. On the upper slope of the K will be those countries that access vaccines relatively fast. On the lower slope of the K will be those countries that are left behind for another year, 2 or 3 or even 4 in terms of vaccinating most of their population. So, fundamentally, I think that has to take place. And fundamentally, I think we need to share resources across the world. So, I will say that, but, other than that, obviously, the issue will be that for many African countries, they are going to be fiscally constrained. Many of them are going to increase their debt burden. We've seen that debt burden already increase in Zambia in particular, in parts of West Africa, Ghana as well. So it's even more necessary now for African countries to cut the red tape, to cut corruption, to liberalize their economies, to embrace to a greater degree the private sector. Many of those issues that were there prior to COVID become even more important now. But I just think that there will be certainly more limitations on what the state can provide. And if there are limitations on what the state can provide, then the private sector really has to step up to the plate. And that's a big debate in South Africa, of course, but it's going to be a big issue in many other African countries as well. Still, having said that, we see a fairly good rebound over the course of the next year to 18 months. It doesn't look bad when you look at the GDP figures for Ethiopia or Kenya or Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire. These economies are going to do 4, 5% perhaps over the next year. It may not be the 8, 9% or 10% that there was 18 months ago, but it's not that bad at all given where we've been. There are tremendous, I think, opportunities still in Mozambique with the natural gas finds coming on stream, although there are security issues there that have to be resolved. But Southern Africa in particular, where I am, are going to lag. Without a doubt, the laggards of the continent are the big economies like South Africa, bringing down the SADC region, and of course Nigeria as well. More lackluster growth in those two countries are going to affect overall African growth. But look, this year's been Africa's first recession, statistically anyway, in 20 years. Next year, we expect African growth to be at around between 3 and 3.5%. So the fight back for Africa, I think, is quite solid. And on that basis, I think the recovery certainly has got legs into the 2022 period.
Great. No, that's really positive, and yeah, good to look at that and not just focus on the big markets. But I did want to, while we've got you on, we talked a lot in our first podcast about the South African market and what was happening down there, and obviously it was a very different environment back then. Of course, the impact of the lockdowns has had a devastating impact on aviation and tourism. I know that, you like us here in the UK have been tarred with having a variant, which is bad press. And, we've been dealing with that too. It's been called the UK variant before we had the South African or the Brazilian variant. So we have to be very careful how we kind of, push that, but it will have an impact for sure. We've also seen, the benefits of removal of state operations within aviation in South Africa. So with SAA hibernating and sorting itself out in whatever form it's going to come back in that interim, now you have Airlink being the second largest carrier in Africa, taking up lots of regional routes. You have new players like Lyft, you have expansions, Comair coming back into the market, and Kalula, with Safair as well. So there's a lot going on, and obviously the beneficiaries there are people paying a lot less. But that recovery seems to have stalled because of the second wave and the curfews and obviously the lack of international travel into South Africa. So, how do you see that environment sort of developing within South Africa itself? And give us an idea of what the impact's been for somebody who's been there on the ground.
Well, John, just if you take the impact where I am in Cape Town and you take the impact on some of our key tourist attractions, an 83% drop in visitors to Robben Island, very close to where I am, between December 2019 and 2020. Table Mountain, 75% drop over the course of the year. And when you look at Cape Town International Airport's passenger traffic, just in December of this last year, 281,000 passengers in 2019, 281,000 in 2020 now, 2 months ago, only 52,000 passengers through the airport. So you get an idea of the severity of the lockdown restrictions and, of course, the drop-off in international travel on us. But from a domestic point of view within South Africa, clearly the domestic market was nowhere nearly sufficient to take up any of the slack as a result of the international, the ban on international travelers and flights and the hassles involved in that. And the further lockdown regulations that we've had over the last month or so in South Africa have actually really severely damaged what could have been a marginal recovery in the travel and leisure industry as well. So I think it's been a very disappointing and difficult period, certainly for the airline sector. But you're right to highlight the point that we've almost sort of the new entrants, a new environment has sort of flushed out. It's flushed out domestic travel within South Africa and potentially also regional and, for that matter, international as well. The new players, I think, are quite exciting. They offer a fresh start and a fresh model away from those models that clearly had problems prior. And I have to say, honestly, because I'm not part of the industry and I look on as an observer, even some of the more successful of our private or independent domestic carriers were not that successful. And even if you take an airline, one of our major airlines, Comair, British Airways, ran into their own degree of difficulties, yes, exacerbated certainly by COVID. So I think that there is an opportunity here to renew in the domestic sector. Part of that opportunity, if I might be honest, is because our national carrier, South African Airways, has not been flying. And as a result, the very busy domestic routes, and in particular the Cape Town-Johannesburg route, can now in fact be operated by multiple independent or private carriers. And that's where the capacity comes from today, simply because there are no South African Airways flights. And as a result, your national airline not only has lost market share in the domestic context, it's now also losing whatever market share it might once have had in the regional context and even in its limited international routes as well, because other players are becoming more influential in South Africa. So the question in the South African space is really around whether we can justify a reboot of the national carrier. And if we can justify it, what does that new look South African Airways really, what does it look like? What routes does it serve? What aircraft does it operate? And how does it compete against so many of these other new players and global players that really do see South Africa as a good market, certainly once normalcy is returned. So it really is, to me, a rather fascinating space to be in. But it does open up the question, and we've all been asking ourselves in the question here in South Africa, should the state be spending large amounts of money on resuscitating South African Airways? And really, what would be the benefit, other than another flag flyer, which has got a nationalistic imperative, but can a new airline really compete against all of these other operators that we both mentioned?
Yeah, I think that's the point. It's about, it has to be able to compete, not to be protected. And every day that goes by, like you say, that slack in the domestic and regional market is being taken up by other players. So is it required? If the connectivity is there and being provided at no cost to the taxpayer, actually at profit to the taxpayer, it's being paid into the fiscus, not coming out. Do you really need it? And I think that's a really interesting conversation, that is obviously being had in the media. And we know a few of the people who are on the new board there, so we'll see what they come up with. But sooner rather than later, and it's where that priority lies. So before we go, we started talking about sort of events. Obviously what AviaDev does is we're an events platform. We bring people together. We're now doing that more than ever, but we're doing it in a virtual world. And you and I were talking about this before we went live. But how do you see in your dreams the future of events, and what do you actually think is is going to happen, and how long will it take before we're back to, are we ever going to get back to what it was? How do you see those trends?
Well, John, I'm confident that we will get back to what it was, because I think, as I've said before, the need for the physical experience, I think, exceeds anything that the virtual can offer. But clearly we are in what I would call sort of transitional phases now with events going forward. For the moment, whilst we roll out a vaccine, it's still going to be largely virtual. But as we move to to good vaccine penetration in regions of the world, we are likely to see the resumption of physical events. Now, those physical events, I think, will be semi-hybrid, to use a nasty term. If participants in those events are from countries where the vaccine rollout program has been delayed or is inefficiently applied, those speakers, for argument's sake, or those attendees will be virtual. So for this interim phase, for the next few years, I expect to see more hybrid events, although, as we've said, there are complexities and costs related to the nature of hybrid. So, virtual is going to continue to be with us for better or for worse. But I do think that perhaps, by the end of next year, 22, and into the early part of 23, we will start to see a recovery of the physical event space across the world. And I certainly know that, even with a modicum of relaxation of restrictions across the world, even with a modicum, companies and corporates are really chomping at the bit to get back to bringing physical attendees together. I've seen that. We saw it in our brief sort of window of opening in the convention industry here in Cape Town in the sort of the third, fourth quarter of last year. And we've seen an increasing demand for future bookings a year out from now. So, I'm not negative about it. I just think that there is a complexity to this virtual world that we live in that we will later look back on as a transitionary phase as we move out of the immediate dangers of COVID.
Yeah, no, great way to put it. And, nobody knows, but that, it may be that some of these big organizations, now that they're moving to people allowing them to work from home, they don't have the overheads of the big office, but they still see the value in, well, you don't need to work together, but we need you to still see customers. Yeah. So that budget is pushed somewhere else and people still need to travel. I've always said, when you see that your customer is actually having a conversation with your competitor at the event that you didn't go to, and you lose that customer, that's when you'll realize that actually I probably do need to start investing in going to live events. But I hope people are a bit more forward thinking, and they don't, they're the ones in the room rather than the ones who have that painful experience. So final thing then, how can our listeners connect with you? How can they book one of your wonderful keynotes? How can they find out more? Give us a bit of an overview.
Yes, well, I spend my life doing research. It's my hobby and my passion, and I'll be very happy to present keynotes on a wide variety of topics. You can see all of my keynote topics on my website. It's www.danielsilkeglobal.com, danielsilkeglobal.com, and I'm on LinkedIn as well, Daniel Silke, obviously, and there's a Twitter feed which covers usually my pontifications on the unfolding drama in the South African political economy. So please connect with me through one of those mediums.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. I'll make sure that all of those are in the show notes as well. So if you're listening, you want to know more, just go to the show notes now and you can click straight through to the website or to Daniel's LinkedIn and connect with him there as well. So really appreciate you taking the time. Hopefully we'll see each other in person in 2021. That would be nice.
I would like that, John. We need to shake our hands properly again. And I look forward to that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So thank you everybody out there for taking the time to listen to us today. As always, all that we ask and all that we've ever asked is that you share this episode with one person in your network you think will benefit. Stay well, stay safe. And until we meet again and we travel again, take all the best and take care. Bye-bye.